So hello everyone and welcome to the first event of the Childhood and Youth Studies Network. So the Torch Childhood and Youth Studies Network seeks to provide a forum for researchers at all career stages, studying young lives, experiences and representations of childhood and youth and the politics of age, both at Oxford, elsewhere in the UK and also elsewhere in the world. We seek to advance childhood and youth studies as a critical interdisciplinary field, which asks urgent questions about the part played by age in shaping experiences of climate change, race, migration, education, culture, and public health. We emphasize how childhood and youth as life stages simultaneously cherished and marginalized, expose the factors at play when determining who counts, both in the academy and beyond. So in the next couple of years, we're going to have a range of events through which we hope to develop this agenda for research and teaching in what we see as a kind of emergent field of childhood and youth studies. So the talk today by Farida is going to be our first event in the network, as well as in the seminar series that we hope to run over the next couple of years. But before I pass to Catherine to introduce Farida and the talk, I'm going to quickly tell you about a couple of other events we have planned. So next Friday at Brasenose College's Platinum Room, we have our first reading group. We will be discussing a paper on the age of consent and climate science in the early 20th century. Subsequent to that, on March 7th, in the morning between 10 and 12 p.m., we have a networking event for undergraduate and graduate students interested in childhood and youth studies. So please do come to those events if you can as well. And if you go to our website, you can sign up to a mailing list, and I'll put that in the chat window. Thank you so much. Catherine, do you want to introduce Farida and the talk?
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, Sneha. And today's speaker is Farida Makar, who's a PhD student at St. Antony's College in Oxford, and who is speaking to us now from Cairo, where she conducts much of her research and does much of her archival work. And Farida's work is kind of at the intersection of history of education, and Middle East studies. And in the chat, I'm going to put some links to her current published work. This includes a very recent 2023 chapter on John Dewey and his influence and the repurposing of his ideas in Egyptian education. It's really exciting actually to have Farida with us, because her work sort of speaks to one of the aims of our network in unsettling those very Western perspectives, often embedded in childhood studies, but also studies of education. And Farida is going to speak to us now on her research, looking at the history of progressive education in 20th century Egypt. And welcome, Farida. I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you so much for the very kind introduction and for inviting me. I'm very, very honored to be with all of you, even though I'm not physically there, but this keeps me grounded. And so I'd like to also thank everybody else who's tuning in. Over the next 40 to 45 minutes, I will be sharing with you some of the main arguments and insights from one of the core chapters of my dissertation. And my dissertation is titled Progressive Education and Egyptian Teachers, 1922 to 1956. And I'll start by first giving you a bit of a background about the dissertation as a whole, so that you can sort of situate. This tries to do two things at the same time. First, it sort of maps out and documents iterations of what we would today call progressive education. And it does that in Egypt during the first part of the 20th century. Second, having sort of mapped out progressive initiatives and concluded that they were indeed important, it seeks to ask why it is that Egyptian teachers were even interested in these ideas. In so doing, the work aims to provide a history of the formation of a professional identity among Egyptian teachers. The first part of the dissertation follows what we can call elite pedagogues. These were teachers with a training in psychology and pedagogy studies who were Egypt's top teacher trainers in the methods of progressive education. The second part shifts its attention away from the higher echelons of the teaching profession to more ordinary teachers and tries to understand the degree to which they were actually interested in these progressive ideas, and if so, why they would have been interested. Finally, the third part of my dissertation traces teachers beyond their classrooms by looking at the ways in which they sought to collectively organize and defend their profession while also clinging to discourses of progressivism. In this presentation, I will be sharing thoughts from a chapter within the second part of my dissertation, which focuses on ordinary teachers. And the chapter itself is titled Experimentations. I first wanted to give you just a very, very short historical background, just because I feel like perhaps some people will not know the context that I'm talking about. So what you should know, it suffices to say that the time period that I'm looking at, which is between starting 1922, is an important time period because this is what historians of Egypt usually refer to as Egypt's semi-independence or semi-colonial context, depending on which angle you're looking at this from. For example, you will usually find historians saying that starting 1919, when Egypt had a sort of a revolution against British occupation, the British occupation let go of many elements of governance, including the realm of education. And this is important because starting 1922, you had the nominal independence, which was sort of announced. And in 1923, you had a new constitution, which made education free, public education free for boys and girls, especially at the primary level. So this is sort of the background that against which I'm sort of operating. It's this post-1919 revolutionary moment with the establishment of a semi-independent state amidst a more global or regional context of extreme colonialization, right? So the rest of the Ottoman Empire, for example, falls prey to colonial power and control, especially in the Levant and countries like Lebanon and Syria, etc., starting this particular period, whereas Egypt is sort of going in a different trajectory. So this is just some background for you to understand where we're heading. In the book, In the Footsteps of Inayat al-Zayat, Iman Mirsel, poet and scholar of the Middle East, remarks, "There is a curiosity that befalls us when the author is unknown, when they are cut from a tree without any known family, when we lack any indication about their birth or their death, about their generation, their friends, peers, or literary parents." Much like Iman Mirsel, whose quest in the book is to trace the life of a previously unknown female author named Inayat al-Zayat, this part of the dissertation tries to weave the experiences of ordinary teachers, sometimes named, but often anonymous, and reimagine what their school days were like, what problems they faced, and to what extent they were able to implement the progressive principles they had been trained in. Ordinary teachers did not necessarily leave behind illustrative renditions of their experience. And indeed, there is no archive that distinctly locates their vision, experiences, and the difficulties they faced within their profession. Apart from the few teachers and school principals who contributed to the pedagogy press, a more creative approach is needed to unearth their voices. To this end, school magazines, ministerial reports, textbooks, and end-of-year examinations are used to reconstruct the material, bureaucratic, and cultural world that ordinary teachers had to contend with. This combination of rather indirect source material allows us to reimagine their professional lives more vividly and center their experiences. I'm so sorry, I just have a technical issue that I want to fix before I move on. Okay, much better. All right. So the chapter that I'm actually presenting is actually preceded by one which is entirely dedicated to the structural impediments to the implementation of progressive practices using some of the sources I just mentioned. So for example, inspection materials, curriculum plans, examination samples, etc. By looking at these sources, I conclude that with its heavy centralization, its examination system, frequent inspections, limited budgets, and rigid curriculum, the Ministry of Education controlled and surveyed teachers and created a system in which it was really difficult to freely explore and experiment. Budgetary constraints, poor facilities, as well as the ministry's policies of control presented real challenges to ordinary teachers. Attempt to deviate from the course set forward by the system could potentially affect a teachers' advancement opportunities. In this sense, it was difficult for ordinary teachers to break away from the system. We must therefore speculate that on the whole, ordinary teachers had a difficult time implementing progressive practices in their own classrooms, not due to laziness or a lack of interest, but because of the immense difficulties imposed on them by the system. So, and I'm really happy to address the findings of that chapter in the Q&A if there's sufficient interest in doing so. However, right now, I would like to focus on the chapter called Experimentations, which tries to demonstrate that despite these sort of built-in restrictions, progressivism had enormous support among ordinary teachers. And the main argument of this chapter is that teachers believed that these methods to be pedagogically effective and to constitute a winning recipe for the strengthening of Egypt's nascent democracy. With its utopian ideals of freedom and its promise to take care of children's individual needs, progressive education foregrounded a blueprint for the training of children in democracy and independence. In this sense, it provided a language and practices of possibility and challenged the teaching styles of their day, thereby laying the groundwork for a better future. So teachers engaged with progressive education through the process of experimentation, hence the title of the chapter, i.e., by testing out different pedagogical tools. It was a playful and oftentimes subversive pedagogical act, which allowed teachers to be creative in their own right and to attempt to improve their own teaching methods within the confines of the system that I've just described and which I talk more about in the chapter before this one. Rather than having one locus of experimental power, the philosophy of experimentation was eagerly adopted by teachers throughout Egypt, although possibly not that many, as they became interested in these trial and error activities to better the learning environments for their students. So let me share 4 instances/examples that demonstrate how teachers were experimenting. The first is through experimental classrooms, which were later called model schools. These were established in the early 1930s and were attached to one of the country's leading teacher training institutions, Ma'had al-Tarbiyah. Their aim was to, quote, test out the theories put forward by pedagogues and to discern which of them were the most suitable to the Egyptian context and how these should be applied to obtain the best pedagogical results, end quote. The programs designed for the initial classrooms centered children's needs and emphasized creativity and play. By 1955, there were 6 model schools under the supervision of Ma'had al-Tarbiyah, but I should note that most of them were around the Cairo area. And the total number of enrolled students was more than 4,000. At these schools, teachers could test out ideas and freely explore the curriculum in collaboration with the students as they saw fit. So I'll give you an example. In 1939, an inventive teacher at the Namuzajiyya school in Hadai al-Ubba noticed that his students were attracted by the butterflies in the garden. They persistently tried to catch them, first with their bare hands, then with sort of handkerchiefs, their tarbush, which is the equivalent of a hat, and finally using palm trees. But the latter method was actually damaging the butterfly wings themselves. The teacher then told them that there were actually specialized nets that you can use to catch butterflies, and that these could be produced in home economics class. This episode turned into a full-fledged pedagogical experiment, which lacked, all thanks to the flexibility and ingenuity of this adventurous teacher. But the keenness to explore experimentation as an act of innovative pedagogy is emblematic of a broader experimental ethos, which swept the pedagogical scene during the interwar period. And this will be our second example. Experimentation heavily relied on the initiatives of ordinary teachers, not just those who were employed by these experimental schools. The Pedagogy Press contains a number of accounts by normal public school teachers who were concerned with the quality of their educational offering and were eager to experiment more freely in their own classrooms. In an article titled خطتي في تدريس الرسم, or My Plan in Teaching Art, a teacher by the name of Habib Iskandar, who was an art instructor at the Abbasiyya Primary School, narrates his own experience with the implementation of modern methods in his art lessons. He says, during the summer holiday, my friend Mr. Muhammad Fuad Effendi from the Khalil Agha School and I decided to put forward a new art instruction program in our respective schools that would incorporate the new methods of education, end quote. Iskandar's article enumerates the different ways in which his new program was executed and the positive results that he observed through a presentation of his students' drawings and artwork. If there ever was an ultimate pedagogical experiment, the so-called rural village schools would have to be it. And this is our third example. Historian Omneya Shakri links the creation of these schools, these village schools that were established in the rural areas, back to the Egyptian Association for Social Studies, the EASS, in 1936, where the Model Village projects originated and which aimed at executing, quote, social reconstruction projects. The EASS also established the Cairo School for Social Work. And as its name suggests, it was the main institution responsible for the training of social workers and the production of social research. As part of their larger effort to tackle Egypt's woes, including disease, housing, hygiene, and poverty, the EASS sought to create these model villages and replicate the project on a nationwide scale. This is what's usually written in the historiography about these model schools. But what the historiography fails to mention is the role played by progressive pedagogues in the development of these ideas long before the social workers. Much of the critique leveled at these schools revolves around their inherent social engineering ethos, their elitism, and their built-in nationalist grandeur. But the sources left behind by Egyptian pedagogues, who were also part of such experiments, present a slightly different account. Many of them viewed the initial experimental phase positively, but became critical of later iterations of these initiatives, fearing that they contradicted what they, as progressive pedagogues, believed to be one of the most basic principles of progressive education, that education should be tailored to the needs of children and that it should be free. Pedagogues were therefore uncomfortable with the village school setup because they believed that such programs created more rifts between classes, or as some of them noted in 1955, quote, these programs upheld the wall between primary and rural schools and prevented children from moving up the pedagogical ladder to the secondary schools, end quote. They also would say that education at these schools should be premised on an understanding, tafahum, of the rural environment and the constant engagement, tafa'ul mustamir, with it. So I'm just using the Arabic words because they're also very telling. They decried the standardized curriculum offered at these schools, which was removed from the life that surrounded the children. And they claimed that these curricula promoted individualism and disregarded students' parents in the learning process. So the emphasis on engagement with the community represents a slight departure from the elite social reconstructionist positions, which were espoused by the EASS. While these pedagogues clearly viewed the school as a vehicle for social advancement and the eradication of rural woes, I mean, nobody would deny it, they maintained a skeptical position towards these programs, especially when they contradicted some of the core progressive beliefs including the importance of linking the environment to the educational content, to the concept of dialogue, to the importance of emphasizing the needs and natural inclinations of children, and the complete denial of children's psychology. And the final example I want to use is the ministerial policies themselves. But worry not, I will not bore you with a series of laws right now. I will just say that many extracurricular activities, which we today regard as a normal component of schooling, and not necessarily progressive, such as, I don't know, school trips, sports classes, music, and social work, actually originated in progressive conversations and experimentations in the early 20th century. Their introduction into the schooling system came via ministerial policies and curriculum reform projects, and should be understood as part of progressive attempts to make schooling more relatable, enjoyable, and adapted to children's needs and inclinations. I just want to check that everybody can hear me and follow. So if anybody can just open the mic and say hello.
Yeah, we're here.
Okay, great. Sorry. All right. So I've sort of tried to tell you so far that there were some people experimenting with the concepts of progressive education in Egypt sometime between 1922 and 1956. But I'm going to start asking the more serious questions. So beyond these few experimental voices and the countless others that I actually talk about in the chapter, can one say that ordinary teachers as a whole were interested in progressivism and convinced that it was the right way to move forward? And if so, why would they engage with progressivism to begin with, given the many challenges that I allude to in the chapter before it? Such questions are of particular importance because in other geographical contexts, not all teachers were in fact interested in progressivism during the interwar period. Laura Tisdale's fantastic work on progressivism in Britain, for example, demonstrates that while elite pedagogues were very much interested in progressive education, ordinary teachers were not. Tisdale suggests, quote, most teachers' resistance to educational psychology was consistent and often vehement. And the thing is that progressive education and child psychology sort of came hand in hand in the early 20th century. So by rejecting some of the tenets of educational psychology, you were also, in some sense, rejecting progressivism, just so that's clear. So most teachers' resistance to educational psychology was consistent and often vehement. However, especially when such resistance was expressed by practicing teachers, this may have had less to do with the content of training colleges and refresher course syllabuses, and more to do with the threat that developmental psychology posed to their own ideals of professional expertise. Far from being at the vanguard of progressive reform, a significant number of teachers resisted progressive innovations because they felt they posed a challenge to their own authority, knowledge, and professional identity. And so we see that in the British case at around the same time period, you know, these elite pedagogues are very interested in these ideas, and the practicing teachers are saying, well, this sort of contradicts my own experience in the classroom, for example. And so you would find these sort of pockets of resistance to the ideas. So what were the sentiments of ordinary Egyptian teachers then? At first glance, one might be inclined to believe that they too had little interest in progressivism. After all, the system was designed to obstruct innovations. However, I will try to show that unlike in the British context, there is actually very little trace of dissent against progressivism among ordinary teachers. The most plausible explanation for this apparent acquiescence is that teachers likely support democracy, and they believe them to hold the secrets to a strong, democratic, and independent nation. But in the absence of a grand-scale survey of teachers' opinions, the only thing I can do is try to show why this was the most likely position to take at the time, I will obviously not be able to say with certainty that this was the position that every single teacher advanced. Silences, implicit support, and explicit approval. In the absence of a comprehensive account of teachers' pedagogical leanings, proving their unequivocal support for progressivism, the least that can be established is an absence of dissent. With a political climate that allowed for certain levels of critique in the press, so again, this is this post-1922 moment, it's a very it would have been perfectly possible for an anti-progressive group of educators to emerge and to express their opinions. The absence of such dissenting voices is telling. Instead, support for progressivism is evident in journals across the board. Oral testimonials collected at the Women in Memory Forum, which is located in Cairo, also support the acceptance of progressive education among ordinary teachers. None of the interviews featured any critique of the methods laid out by progressive education. The absence of critique is also a feature in non-pedagogy related journals, in magazines such as Al-Thaqafa, Al-Musawwir, and Al-Muqtataf, which were three of the very famous publications at the time. We see very often articles featured about progressive education without the critique. In the 1940s, there were three major conferences on the principles of progressive education in Egypt, and all three were quite well attended. In one of them, we have about 600 attendees. And in all three conference proceedings, there is little trace of dissent. In short, critiques of progressivism were rare, and it seems that many were eager to implement progressivism in their own classrooms, despite the difficulties. But to exclude the possibility of there being an alternative model capturing the attention of ordinary teachers, which would explain the lack of dissenting voices, we must first explore depictions of these alternatives as they appeared in the pedagogy press and in teachers' writings. In other words, maybe nobody was critiquing progressivism openly because they were just too busy supporting something else, right? So what are these alternative models that could have been interesting for teachers? So there are three: the fascist, the traditional, and the Islamic models. The first of these is, of course, the fascist alternatives, which rose to prominence beginning in the 1930s. Historians Israel Gershoni and James Jankowski have shown that, quote, most of the shapers of Egyptian public opinion were by and large unreceptive to fascism and Nazism, largely rejecting the ideas and practices that characterize European fascism. Even in the later 1930s, when fascist regimes were at the zenith of their popularity and power, the majority, although not all, Egyptian voices supported liberal democracy against the fascist challenge. The multiple difficulties Egypt was experiencing in the 1930s notwithstanding, most Egyptian commentators sought to reform and improve rather than to replace or destroy the existing Egyptian parliamentary system, end quote. And this is the system that I was telling you about, which emerged in the wake of 1919 and the 1922 semi-colonial reality. Much like the rest of the Egyptian intelligentsia, Egypt's pedagogues remained anti-fascist in their orientation. Even though these systems promised order, discipline, and control, features that one could have expected Egyptian pedagogues to be attracted to. As Salmoni notes, quote, Egyptian pedagogues were unreservedly critical of Nazi Germany, viewing it as a dictatorship mired in hero worship, end quote. And many of them decried their pedagogical methods in which, quote, people became soldiers, were stripped of intellectual freedom as their rulers thought for them, end quote. Salmoni's observations are confirmed through teachers' contributions to the pedagogy press, not just those published by the American University in Cairo, which is where that quote comes from, but also in publications without any affiliations to Anglo-American institutions. In 1939, a teacher by the name of Muhammad Rida Muhammad published an article in Al-Ulum magazine summarizing his impressions of a 3-week trip to Germany that same year. Needless to say, his impressions were less than flattering, as he presents a sharp critique of the social and political context he was observing. In one instance, Muhammad notes, quote, "The truth is that a tourist in Germany would feel as though he walked into another world, a dreamlike world in which the individual loses his will, has been programmed like a machine without a personality, and works towards the good of the state and sacrifices his children for the state," end quote. Such accounts were also echoed in Sahifat al-Ta'lim al-Ilzami, the magazine aimed at compulsory school teachers. In 1935, the magazine published a translation of an article by R. Nicholson titled "Self-Imposed Dictatorship and How to Fight It." And in the article, the author says, "We are in dire need of teachers who would free themselves from the shackles of dictatorship and resist it violently." Similarly, one could conclude that Egyptian pedagogues were interested in some sort of an Islamic model. So we move to the rest of pedagogy. But here too, appearances can be deceiving. This is because Islamic education, whatever its definition may have been for those referring to it as such in the pedagogy press and in their writing, was used to support and promote the principles of progressive education. This was true of senior pedagogues as much as it was of public intellectuals and ordinary teachers. In his 1944 work, Siyasat al-Ta'lim fi Misr, Education Policy in Egypt, Ismail al-Qabbani, one of the country's leading progressive pedagogues, suggests that pre-modern education at institutions such as Al-Azhar, despite its many flaws, quote, was connected with the life of the students and their emotions, end quote. We find a similar position in Ahmad Abdussalam al-Kirdani's presentation at the 1945 Conference on Progressive Methods of Education. And this is one of the 3 conferences I referred to above, or just a few minutes ago. And he says, "If you analyze the opinions of modern educationalists and explore the principles that they are calling for, you will find that these are in fact calls to set the human mind free from traditional restrictions. It is not dissimilar to the calls to freedom prescribed in the Holy Quran, which encourage people to think for themselves, instead of accepting what their leaders decide for them," end quote. In his seminal 1938 dissertation titled Tarikh al-Ta'lim fi Ahd Muhammad Ali, the history of education under Muhammad Ali, Abdul Karim, historian, nostalgically depicts the benefits of education at Al-Azhar, again suggesting that, quote, "The student was left to himself without any form of supervision in terms of attendance, control over whether he was being studious or lazy. He was not subjected to any form of examination after he had completed his studies. Do we not find in this complete freedom enjoyed by the members of Al-Azhar in past centuries similarities to the systems being introduced in modern universities today? These same systems that rely on freedom of choice and individual responsibility, the type of freedom that prepares them for the life of men ahead. Do not forget that the most knowledgeable members of Al-Azhar from this century and the one preceding it were exposed to such methods. There is no doubt that this sort of freedom tends to bring about strong wills and personalities," end quote. The notion that pre-modern forms of education, so whether you want to call them Islamic or something else, inherently bore resemblance to the methods espoused by progressivism seems to have been a popular trope in the pedagogy press, as recognized by historian Barak Salmoni. These examples demonstrate that even when Islamic models were pursued, progressive pedagogy dominated the conversation, and the excitement around its ability to promote freedom, independence, and democracy always took center stage. One final alternative with the potential to rival progressivism is the so-called traditional model. By this, I am referring to European state-sponsored public education, a system that was initially introduced in Egypt in the 19th century, much like in the rest of the world, but whose more troubling attributes were actually designed by the British occupation, and more specifically by a man named Douglas Dunlop, who was the British occupation's advisor and controlled the Ministry of Education from about 1884 to 1922. That is, it would be perfectly plausible to suppose that ordinary teachers were in fact content with the pedagogical circumstances that they found themselves in, and that they did not regard progressive education as a solution if there was a problem to begin with. This would fit with Tisdall's findings about the British context, where it could be argued that child-centered educationalists created an invented opponent in the form of traditional education in England and Wales, suggesting that it was much more coherent, intransigent, and persistent than it actually was in order to present themselves as moving towards a better future, end quote. In a sense, unlike the elite pedagogues, perhaps ordinary Egyptian teachers did not regard Egypt's public school system as a traditional enemy after all. However, such a claim runs two important risks. First, it ignores the multiple complaints documented by ordinary teachers, and which actually created an entire chapter in my dissertation. More importantly, it obfuscates the intrinsic connection between the post-1922 education system and the British occupation. Unlike in England, where the enemy, traditional education, may have been a mere fabric of child-centered imaginations, in Egypt, the bête noire was actually Douglas Dunlop and his lasting legacy. Turn-of-the-century Egyptian education was under his total control. Until about, even after 1906, actually arguably until 1922. In fact, he was responsible for all aspects of the implementation of educational policies that were set up by the High Commissioner Cromer. He continued to restrain the expansion of European education, maintaining fees that were very high and curtailing scholarships. Historian Salmoni suggests that as a Scotsman in the service of British policy, he combined an overarching hands-off approach to educational development with an unrelenting commitment to centralized control of Egypt's educational bureaucracy and regulations. In this, he reflected his upbringing. Since the 1870s, Scottish education had been characterized by close state control, and so it resembled more closely the French or the Prussian approach as opposed to that of the English approach. But even when Dunlop left Egypt after about 25 years of service, his policies remained, or at least such was the narrative expressed in the pedagogy press. Many of the system's problems, such as excessive centralization, examinations, and inspections, so the sorts of problems I tackled in the chapter before this one, originated from his tenure or were associated with his legacy in the accounts left by teachers. For example, at this 1945 conference on progressive methods, Muhammad Sami Ashur, a teacher, suggested that the system of inspection was, quote, inherited baggage from the early years of the 20th century, a time when inspectors' sole purpose was to critique and find mistakes. Similar sentiments were expressed by Abdelhamid Fahmi Matar in 1939 in one of his seminal works called At-Ta'lim wal-Muta'attilun, the Education and the Unemployed, where this teacher dedicates an entire section of his book to the remnants of Dunlop. He says the Egyptian school is still suffering from the heavy legacy left behind by Dunlop. Schools are still preoccupied with unnecessary routine, and they remain detached from the environment around them, end quote. When in a student-led interview in 1937, pedagogue Amin Sami Hassouna, he was then the director of Mahad al-Tarbiyah, the Teacher Training Institute, was asked whether he thought Egypt's education system had made any progress. Hassouna proclaimed that Egypt was, quote, free of colonial rule, but that teachers were still governed by the methods imposed by Dunlop and the Dunlopians, end quote. It was therefore imperative to set teachers free so that education can become democratic, otherwise there was no hope for the country. These assertions suggest that there was a belief that progressive education was paramount for the continued independence and democracy of the country. At the same time, it was necessary for education itself to become democratic in order for this to materialize. In other words, a democratic progressive education was vital for Egypt's resistance against tyranny and colonialism. These few examples demonstrate that while it is nearly impossible to ascertain the true sentiments of all ordinary Egyptians, ordinary teachers, it is plausible to speculate that many saw progressive education as an important tool against the legacies of the British occupation. On a certain level, the Dunlopian tradition became the manifestation of continued British presence, while progressive pedagogy promised to hold the keys for resistance. So what these three models have in common is that all of them, by exploring them further, we realize that there is some sort of a relationship between the belief in progressivism and democracy. So there was an admiration for this relationship between democracy and progressivism. When in 1923, the country's first constitution was promulgated, it cemented the semi-democratic system that I talked about, a multi-party plurality, a new dawn for party politics. The constitution ensured Egyptian control over all matters pertaining to education and created new opportunities for the expansion of the education system. But the interest in constitutional democracy did not just stem from this correlation. Many elite pedagogues, and certainly a few ordinary teachers, believed in the importance and the power of the democratic process and expressed such beliefs in the press. Public intellectuals such as Taha Hussein relied on the democratic process to influence education policy. As historian Hussein Ahmed has recently noted, quote, "For Taha Hussein, the battle for education and the battle for democracy were one and the same," end quote. Historian Susie Ferguson suggests that this interest arose even earlier, dating back to at least 1908. With its promise to bring about a bright and democratic future and to cement these newly acquired political gains of independence, progressive education promised to secure Egypt's nascent democracy for the future. The merit of this kind of education lay in its ability to chart a democratic and independent reality. And I will sort of glance over a few examples, writings of pedagogues who are talking about this relationship between progressivism and democracy. In the introduction to her translation of John Dewey's Democracy and Education, pedagogue Ihsan al-Kusi, who was an inspector of the secondary education, suggests that she sort of shares that she decided to translate parts of the book in the hope that it would be taught at Egyptian training institutions, not just because it was originally produced for a democratic nation, but because it was, quote, unique in its philosophy, modern in its theories, which are suitable to the present age. This notion that it was a book fit for the zeitgeist of the interwar period was also echoed by many of her colleagues. In May 1952, so this is 2 months before the free officer coup, which basically overturned this regime that I've been talking about, the parliamentary system, and established, technically established the current regime. So before the officer coup in 1952, pedagogue El-Damirdesh Serhan, who was an instructor at the Institute for Female Teachers, published an article titled Al-Madrasa fi al-Mujtama al-Demokrati, the School in a Democratic Society. In it, he makes a very interesting argument that schools have the duty to uncover the deficiencies and challenges of society to their students, but that they cannot lead a revolution against their own societies. They must therefore tread a fine line between educating their pupils about the social woes without actively encouraging them to go against it, because Serhan believed that Egypt had chosen democracy out of conviction. And so it was the system which allowed for the most freedoms for its individuals, and it had the best chances for development. And it was the duty of Egyptian schools to, quote, support the foundations of a democratic life in its utmost form, end quote. And I mean, I don't want to bore you with too many details, so maybe I'll just, I'll glance over to another quote, which I find to be also very significant. And this one's by Al-Qabbani, the famous progressive pedagogue that I referred to earlier. And so he also pronounced himself on the matter and says, does it suit us to have a worker or a farmer who understands nothing in life's matters except things related to his profession? Would this person be a productive member of society? Can he participate in social action? Can he cast his vote in a democratic election? End quote. So it was not just necessary to focus on schooling in general, because it was or the primary and levels of schooling in general, because it was the only thing accessible to a student, but because progressive thought believed that childhood was fundamental for the development of the cognitive skills upon which a true democratic project rested, such as critical thinking, self-reliance, and independent thought. So many of these authors really believed that these principles had to be children had to be exposed to them at a younger age. And so hence this sort of obsession with promoting education in general, but promoting progressivism more specifically. I'm almost done, I promise. In light of this ubiquitous pro-democratic context in which even ardent arch-nems as well, so I don't want to make it sound like they were all, holding hands and singing Kumbaya. But, if we have a context in which even these ardent arch-nemesis were ideologically related, it is likely that many ordinary teachers sort of placed themselves somewhere on this progressive spectrum. It is also likely that they embraced progressivism because of its promise to secure independence and strengthen Egypt's nascent and relatively frail democracy. Continued British presence and control over other aspects of Egyptian life, and their political meddling and interference, especially as of the 1930s and obviously the 1940s, created a sense of urgency and a need for action. While different segments of Egyptian society negotiated the contours and the forms of this kind of action, it is likely that ordinary teachers embraced progress to these threats. Progressivism may not have spread as elite educators hoped it would, but unlike other geographical contexts, the reasons for its failure were symbolically tied to the legacy of the British occupation. This meant that progressivism was somewhat of an uncharted territory. Few had tried it. Its allure and reputation were therefore intact, and the few who implemented its methods provided raving reviews in the press. In the eyes of many pedagogues who, due to their circumstances, were actually able to implement these practices, the methods were actually effective. The few testimonials we have of ordinary teachers suggest a certainty and in their efficacy and a belief that they were more suitable for children. In other words, many teachers believed that they actually worked. Moreover, these methods allowed teachers to project their democratic aspirations onto the immediate setting of the school. As Salmoni notes, quote, when Egyptian educators spoke of schools where open elections produced responsive leaders who cooperated with fellow students through delegation of responsibility under the watchful yet unintrusive eye of the school administration, it is likely that they were conveying a clear counter-image and remedy to the socio-political malaise confronting their Egypt, end quote. Progressivism gave Egyptian teachers a recipe for the resistance of continued British control by providing a language and practices of resistance and continued hope for a better future. It therefore lends itself to being the most likely pedagogical model attracting young, ordinary teachers in the early 20th century. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Farida. We will Snake's back as well. Thank you so much. What a great paper. It was really interesting. I think both Sneha and myself probably have some questions. Just for the audience, if you tap on the Q&A, you can ask any questions and we will relay them to Farida. If I can kind of kick it off, just before we started, you were talking a little bit about the challenges of finding sources and the kind of really DIY strategies you use. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Do you want me to answer the questions right away, or should I take? Yeah, okay.
If you can answer this one, like
Sure.
What kind of strategies did you have to develop to figure out how to
Right.
history of education and childhood in Egypt, especially during the lockdown?
Right. This session is recorded, so I will be very diplomatic in my answer. Any historian of the Middle East will know that access to the national archives in Egypt is very, very difficult. You need a special permit, which you receive officially from the National Archive, but unofficially it comes from the certain security apparatus. And unfortunately, I was denied access to the archive. And by the time I was back in Egypt, it was during the lockdown, and honestly did not have the heart to go through the process of application again. So given this, I've had to be a bit more creative with the source material. There are, I would say, 3 spaces or avenues that I consulted. The first and most important one is via these backstreet booksellers who advertise their work on Facebook and who, you know, let's say there's a library that's emptying out its collection, or someone who dies and their collection is, you know, whatever, just, you know, so they'll go and they'll purchase things there. It's a vast underground network, I suppose. And so they've helped me find the following materials: school magazines, some reports, pedagogy journals, all of the manuals or teacher training manuals, works works authored by these progressive pedagogues that I focus on. So this is sort of the type of material that I've been able to consult. The second avenue has been the Ministry of Education in Egypt, and not a lot of people know this, but it does have an archive and a library. And I would say that access to this library/archive is much easier. And so I was able to obtain access to the library, and they have a collection of textbooks from the 19th century, which I, you know, briefly consulted, but that's not the focus of my work. But also they have, you know, reports, which was very significant. They have some of the reports that don't exist at the, or maybe they do exist at the National Archives, but I don't know because I've never been there. And then the third avenue has been the National Library, where you do have access to all of these publications. So it's mainly published materials. Now, I've also been lucky to have access to the Women and Memory Forum, which I talked about here. This is a fantastic research center located in Cairo, and one of their biggest programs has been the collection of oral testimonials from women in Egypt who were influential throughout the 20th century. And I was very, very lucky to randomly find out that they had a collection of testimonials from female teachers. So these interviews were conducted in the late 90s, early 2000s with women who were in their 80s. And so it fits perfectly with my timeline. And so I've also had the chance to read through, let's say, 25 to 30 oral narratives that were very insightful, really, because they sort of, to my, you know, when you're along in your research and then you stop and you think, wait a minute, what if I've got it all wrong? And then I read these testimonials. I was like, oh, it's okay. Oh yeah, they're okay. I'm fine. You know, so it was a very nice confirmation that what I had been doing was that I was more or less on the right, or that I had captured some of this, I hope, correctly. So yeah, sorry, this was a bit long, but it's a very long story.
No, it's really interesting. I think it's a really good example of the kind of creativity you need to construct a history of childhood. In any case, I mean, Sneha and myself have just been looking at what's in the Bodleian, and even there, like, locating childhood materials is actually incredibly challenging because it's not archived in a way that they're findable. But yeah, it is possible. It's a thing that is achievable. Now, Sneha, if you have a question.
Yeah, I have a kind of selfish question, and I'm sorry to be that terrible academic, but you mentioned school magazines, and school magazines is something I work on as well. So I think I was curious as to, you know, what sorts of materials do school magazines contain, and do they tell us anything about how young people themselves received this sort of project of progressive education, or I think in my experience, school magazines can be quite stilted in the types of things that they publish as well. But I'm just curious if you get anything particular out of them.
Yeah, so my answer to that will be that it depends on the school. So obviously all of these were public schools that I'm looking at, but it seems to me that some of them were a bit more laissez-faire in terms of the editorial board and the teacher intervention than others. So in some school magazines, you find, for example, you know, a section where students are allowed to mock their teachers and like talk about how they would walk into class late or stuff like that. So you would get a sense, and they would say, oh, this teacher is really loving and nice, and you know, they treat us kindly, and this one just makes us memorize everything by rote. So there were some schools where this was present, some magazines, sorry, where this was present. But in the majority of them, I feel like, as you say, they're very sterile, and they're always sort of, I feel like there's a formula for these school magazines. Like you've introduced the editorial board, and then you get like the important sort of general knowledge topics, right? Like this is a telescope, the telescope, you know, and then you get to the, but what for my purposes, what I always found interesting was the latter part of the magazine, which tends to, where you find these photographs of the different clubs. And to me, at least, it gave me a sense of what sorts of activities were being introduced in the schools, because as I tried to explain, so a lot of these activities, we don't tend to think of them as part of the progressive package, but in fact they are. So like, you know, if they talk about excursions, in the 19th century, you didn't necessarily have excursions as part of the school curriculum, for example, or just having all of these sports teams. Like the sports teams are actually introduced in the 1920s. And so for me, it was also interesting to see how progressivism permeated through the structures of the school, without necessarily giving me any insights about whether students thought this was a nice thing or a bad thing, or and how they felt about it. So I don't know if this answers the question, but.
Yeah, like Sneha, I also work on school magazines a little bit. And I was wondering, do you think there's room for thinking through about the type of structure of the magazine itself and the type of vision of society it's offering up, where lots of people are participating in various ways in collective activities?
Mm-hmm.
But also, and there can be kind of variations that can be quite hierarchical, like people winning prizes, and there's sort of variant models of society that can be shaped even just through them collecting particular types of information and packaging it.
Yeah, I mean, on some level, you cut up a bit, so I'm not sure if I understood the entire question correctly. But I would say that they're meant as very participatory projects. I have the sense that they're usually meant as a project. The listed intention is always to involve as many people as possible and to represent the school community as a whole. Now that doesn't always end up happening, because it depends on the editorial team and how many students are involved in it. And I also found that, so at primary schools, there's a lot more direction than secondary schools, where students seem to play a much bigger role in like the production of the magazine. I don't know if this answers your question, because but I would say that the intent is always for it to be a school magazine, like, and nobody would in their right mind state that even if the editor-in-chief is a teacher, he would never he or she, but it was more likely a he, they would never state, openly, oh, we don't want students to participate. The intention is always, yes, we want as many, to be inclusive and have children play a role and all of that.
Yeah, we also have not a question, but a comment from one of the attendees. Anne-Marie Valdez just said that the talk was really wonderful, and she encouraged you to keep going despite the difficulty of the archives. I'm just a reminder to anyone, you're welcome to ask questions. I do have kind of another question. I was wondering, sort of, you in your other research, you kind of talked a little bit about sort of models of education that are seen as a Western phenomenon and imposed on the rest of the world. And I was wondering, and that this is something that kind of misunderstands how sort of ideas actually develop and land in different places. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about childhood and how ideas of childhood feature here. Are the competing models of childhood? Obviously Nazism comes with its own ideas of what childhood are. Are there different variants of what childhood is that you see being sort of mulled over or presented?
So I think that this question sort of lies at the intersection between my work and the work of people like Susie Ferguson. Because Susie focuses more on discourses of childhood and motherhood, or at least the role of the domestic in sort of shaping or creating the child or the model child at about the same time period. While I look at the discourse surrounding childhood that is being produced by the official state institutions, and more specifically the Ministry of Education or public schools, etc. And I feel, even though it's a universal space, I would argue that they're looking at themselves, or they're considering themselves a universal space that is both applicable to men and women, but it's a very masculine voice, I would say, so it's really interesting that so I feel like as far as I know, the different conceptions of childhood emerge from the different child rearing organizations / institutions / people, right? When you're talking about the child that emerges within the confines of the family, and where the mother is the primary caregiver, and the kinds of attributes that the child should have within this context, I feel like the model is slightly different than when you're talking about the school itself, where there's an understanding that it's a much more sort of public, I don't know how to say it. It's like more of a public persona, more of a societal role almost. I don't know. I'm not sure if it's something to think about. I'm also not familiar with any literature or any this conversation or discussion or discourse from the time period that specifically talks about like the Nazi conceptions, for example, or let's say, so militarized conceptions of childhood. I don't see that happening until much later. I'm concerned with the sources that I've consulted. It really seems like progressive education was the dominant model, and conceptions of childhood as eventual democratic citizens, thinking citizens, was the most prevalent idea. And childhood. So I should say that some progressives, and I count Taha Hussein among them, believed that yes, democracy was important to education and vice versa, but that these principles of critical thinking, etc., were developed later in life, for example, at the university stage. And so that's why for him, he had a very particular conception of how the education system should be structured, so that more and more people had access to secondary education and later the university, so that they could develop these cognitive faculties at the appropriate time. But I would also argue that the most other progressive pedagogues thought that was not true. And in some sense, if you, reached 18 and hadn't learned how to critically think and think for yourself, you were sort of doomed. And so their idea was, we need to pool all of the resources of the country to ameliorate primary level education, because there were different tiers. So we need to ameliorate that stage, because this is where a child becomes a a future democratic citizen.
I wonder if I can jump in with another question. So I was, as you were speaking, I was wondering how much of this is gendered, do you think, as well? And does that come through at all in your archive? Because at least in South Asia where I work, often you see kind of ideas about what type of cognitive development boys should be having and what type of cognitive development girls should be having, sort of diverging by the time they're in their mid-teens at least, right? And also in terms of physical activity in schools and that type of thing, there's, you know, quite a lot of difference in the ways in which boys' growth was assessed in terms of, yeah, these things versus girls' growth, right? And quite a sort of strong discourse about girlhood kind of comes into being. So I'm just curious if you could comment on some of that.
So my sense from what I've seen so far is that you had different variations of the gendered question, depending on the different groups that you're talking about that were operating at the time. I think that by the 1940s and definitely by the 1950s, most of the people in the progressive camp believed that progressive methods were applicable to both boys and girls, and that girls were just as able to perform in schools, in sports, etc., as boys. But at the same time, there was always a specialized curriculum for girls, and this included home economics and mainly it was this idea of home economics and needlework and all of the standard things that, you know, begin to emerge, I suppose, in the late 19th century worldwide, and it kind of sticks. And it's only very, like, it takes a very long time for this to you know, to disappear. But even that gender distinction was weaved into the language of progressivism, because progressivism has this very big component of learning by doing, right? And so even if we're going to say that girls will be weaving and boys will be doing carpentry, the important thing is that they're doing things with their hands, right? And so there's more of an emphasis on the fact that these are activities that are manual in some sense, and therefore compatible with progressivism, at least from the sources I've been reading, you know. Because a lot of these progressive, like the female progressive pedagogues, were also very interested in like teaching needlework or cooking and things like that, you know. So they were, so that obviously that is part of the story, but it gets weaved into this progressive discourse. But when it comes to things like intelligence, because they were also interested in intelligence tests, who wasn't, you know, at the time. So they're interested in intelligence tests, and in all of the progressive pedagogues that I've consulted, the ones who, male progressive pedagogues, I mean, they all say there's absolutely no difference between, you know, a female brain and a male brain, and girls are completely capable of, you know, I'm sure you had the sentence that was talking, really. So I would say there's like things that are there side by side. Right?
Absolutely, thank you. I don't think we have any other questions from the audience. Does anyone else want to put a question into Q&A or into the chat?
While we're waiting, Farida, could you tell me a little bit, because it's not an area I know a lot. What type of history of childhood and history of education, where is it at in relation to studies of Egypt at the moment? And in terms of mainstream Egyptian history, does it figure very much to be discussing education or childhood? What's it like to be like a historian of education in that setting?
Okay, I think what I'll do is I'll have to differentiate between academics who produce work in Arabic and academics who are perhaps more in touch with the sort of either Anglo-American academia or French academia, because there are a lot of connections there. So in the Arabic speaking world, I would say, of history of education in Egypt, I would say that, I mean, I'm thinking of works that appeared in the 1960s, 70s, etc. The history of education is always pretty much told within the broader history of Egypt's nationalist movement, or the history of state formation, or which are, I guess, closely related, or the history of political Islam, because it doesn't do us any service that, founders of the Muslim Brotherhood like Hassan al-Banna was a teacher, and so automatically you think education, Islam, political Islam. I mean, and so so I would say that traditionally this has been the way in which it's been tackled. It's always seen as a tool used by different groups to either, build the state or produce nationalist subjects who love their country, or produce, Islamic leading, supporters of Islamist movements, for example. And so it's usually talked about in these terms. There are a few exceptions. There's a scholar who wrote a master's thesis in the 1970s. His last name is Dave. His first name now escapes me. I think it's Abdullah, but I'm not sure. Anyway, his dissertation, he does more of he explores one person, Ismail Qabbani, in his dissertation, and so it becomes this like one-man show of like, here's this man who single-handedly introduced, for example, this kind of education into Egypt. In the English-speaking academy, I would say that things were the same until very recently. I want to say that in the 1980s and 90s, especially with the sort of post-colonial wave, again, the questions of education were always addressed, within the sort of very Foucauldian lens of, this is an arm of the state and it's all about control. Or, look, there are these people who are using it in different ways to advance an Islamist agenda, and there was always this dichotomy. And I think that things are changing a bit now. This is very important. There's work on different progressive pedagogues in Palestine, and there's work on like interregional work that's happening, like what were the knowledge exchanges between countries of the Arab world in the early 20th century. So there's a bit more interesting work happening now. And I think people are slowly but surely moving away from these paradigms, which are very important. I mean, I'm obviously not trying to undermine them, but I feel like they fail to capture a lot of the nuance, a lot of the debates, a lot of the discrepancies, and the humanity of these people, And so I would say that, my work is in a way trying to paint a picture of these people that tries to bring them back into the picture, not necessarily as these nationalist actors or these Islamist actors, or, just as teachers first, and then maybe something else.
Amazing. We have a question from Haroon Ford. During the initial period, the British were still in Egypt, and there were growing tensions around their presence, which obvious incidences like the assassination of General Lee Stack highlighted. Did these tensions impact education or investments in progressive education in any way?
So I'm assuming that you mean the sort of very early parts of the 20th century. And so, okay, the British occupation from 1882 onwards invested very little in education as a whole. I have a table which shows the the overall expenditures of the state, the percentage of education within the overall expenditure of the state. And it's not even, I mean, it's like 1% of the state budget went to education under British occupation. And in addition, there's this sort of two-tier system that I vaguely alluded to that was introduced by Douglas Dunlop, which essentially made good primary education for not for free, so you had to pay to get into public schools, and then it provided these what we call compulsory / elementary schools that were available for free for the rest of the population, but were not very good. And within this context, there were still, I mean, you see the beginnings of these progressive voices who are, interested in these ideas and trying to implement them, but within the restrictions that were imposed by the British, it was very difficult to do so. And so that sort of liberating moment comes in the post-1922 period, even if the British were still in control of many other aspects of Egyptian public life, including the Suez Canal, including, at some point, barricading and surrounding the palace in 1942, so even though you have these incidents where the sites of colonialism are very glaring, within the realm of education, Egyptians were actually in control of the budget and the policies starting 1922. And so I want to say, so by the time you reach 1948, the percentage of the budget that went to education was 13%. So you have a jump that increases slowly, especially in the post-1922 period. And these were the kinds of resources that these progressive pedagogues, who were all influential within the ministry, saw necessary. These are the kinds of policies that they saw necessary to ameliorate education, investing in more schools and better schools.
Amazing. So we have, I think, what will be our final question. Lily Stone says, thank you for sharing your work, Farida. You mentioned intelligence tests and earlier creating citizens who could participate in democracy. But I would like to ask if there were other ways in which pedagogues and teachers also understood or talked about the success of their progressive teaching practices, and if so, what these were.
Other ways, meaning, I think the way I will answer this question is something I also alluded to in the talk. So there were success stories. The experimental classrooms turned model schools were considered a success story. You had occasional the models in a press. You had these success stories, and I suppose they were talked about with a lot of enthusiasm. But because this was never something, I don't know, I used to tell my students this was not Finland in 2021, where supposedly these methods are being implemented on a wide scale, and you can, so it remains this sort of magic potion, or this like fountain of youth or something, so it's this thing that we're aspiring to implement, but nobody has actually implemented it. And in fact, in the chapter before this one, I, after tearing apart the conditions in Egypt and talking about how there was no way this was going to get implemented given the budgetary restrictions, even if the budget increased, it was still nowhere near what it should have been to implement these practices. I talk about all of these problems, and at the end I sort of say, yeah, but it didn't really work anywhere. It's not like, we have this one country that, in 1925 comes up and says, we did it, we're progressive, it didn't really happen anywhere, right? So I suppose this is the thing, is that it always was regarded as this uncharted territory, this magic potion. If we only were to implement it, things will get much better. And I believe that this was the only way that it was talked about in the Egyptian context. I know that in other contexts, so I know that in the American context, for example, by the 1950s and 60s, people were considering these methods to be completely obsolete and to be the source of all woes and the reason why we have entitled children. I get that. We don't have that kind of discourse at all in the Egyptian context, because basically you have that heyday of progressivism worldwide where Egypt is participating just like any other country at the time, and then you have the 1952 coup. And then it sort of becomes co-opted in the language of the new regime in very particular ways. And then it kind of fades away because you have all of these other more important things. We're building the nation by building a high dam and, like going into war and like, nationalizing the Suez Canal. And there's like more important, like there are other ways to build a nation suddenly, or, and also what democracy, and so, you reach the state where it's kind of irrelevant. So I will argue that it never left this realm of the enchanted magic potion,
That's really interesting. Thank you so much. Does that bring us to the end, Catherine?
It does. I just think in the end, I'm just going to share on the chat the email address for our network site, which is probably the best place to look for updates about our future events. And this will include some other online seminars and other hybrid events. So do join even if you're not with us in Oxford.
And just to remind you, next week we have a reading group on Friday at Brasenose College, where we're going to be talking about Ashwini Tambe's work on the age of consent and climate science in the early 20th century. And then we also have on March 7th a networking event for graduate and undergraduate students interested in childhood and youth studies. Yeah.
So I think the last thing that remains to do is to thank Farida for her really illuminating talk. Thank you so much for braving your Wi-Fi issues to share your research with us, and best of luck with completing it.
Thank you so much,
and I hope to see you back here soon.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.